The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Scaling Agile Testing Using the TMMi by Tom Cagley. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming PSQT conference in San Diego, California, August 14th through the 19th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. PSQT is the only conference that focuses on practical best practices in every aspect of software quality assurance and testing. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To learn more about this exciting conference, visit psqtconference.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at psqtconference.com. At the end of today's webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. At IIST, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Tom Cagley. Tom?
Thank you very much, Eric. And I'd actually threatened Eric before we started that perhaps what I would do is just immediately go to questions and not do the presentation so that you'd have a lot of questions because you wouldn't know what we're talking about. And that might, people might say, well, that's the Agile way kind of thing. But I think let's put that kind of stuff aside for a second and recognize that whether when we're talking about Agile comes in a wide number of flavors and styles, whether using Scrum, and I'll have sort of a Scrummy flair to this, but there are other varieties, whether it's using some of the lean concepts and doing Kanban, so that you're combining Scrum, Kanban, extreme programming, those sorts of things. There are just all sorts of different varieties. If you're talking about building and doing large-scale Agile, you might be dealing with things like Scaled Agile Framework Enterprise, SAFe, or DAD, or even DSDM. Lots of different frameworks, lots of different approaches to this. But one of the biggest problems that people really are wrestling with over time is the fact that how do you fit testing into Agile? And there are just a ton of ways of doing that. Some of them are less Agile and some of them are more Agile. And we'll talk about how we use things like the TMMi to get there. So the agenda for today really is, we're going to start with a little bit of history, and we're going to start with maybe a little history of Agile and a little bit of history about the TMMi. Why do we care about the TMMi? I mean, it's a framework, and that's important, but hey, we're Agile, we don't need frameworks. Well, I'm going to suggest that that's one of the reasons that we care. What is that thing, the TMMi, other than a T, two M's, and an I? And it sounds a lot like the CMMI, which may or may not be something that we're comfortable talking about today. And then finally, at the end, we'll do a little bit of a case study about how one organization found it useful in terms of using it to scale up, to take basic team-level Agile and make it into something that could deliver very large projects, very large programs, or, depending on the words that you use, very large products. So we start really in our world with a little bit of history. The goal of this idea of Agile and the lean concepts is really to blow up a lot of the different silos. When I began writing code and then later moved over to testing, and no, I didn't think of that as a demotion. I thought that was really stepping up in the world. I could actually make a difference, and then later into methodologies, maybe they were telling me that if I couldn't, no, I'm sorry, I won't go there. But all of those were different silos that people had to deal with. So our goal is to remove the silos. So people like Capers-Jones have gone and looked at all of the different name specialties within information technology development. And very frankly, when I worked for them, I helped participate on that study, and in reality, there were more named specialties within the IT group, and that included all of the technical side and all of the development and testing. There were more named specialties than in medicine. And while I'll agree that what we do is complex, that's crazy. And each one of those has their own specialty. That specialty represents an individual silo. And very frankly, given that, it becomes very difficult. Agile at the team level, using things like Scrum and extreme programming, and I'm going to use the abbreviation of extreme programming from now on is XP. But that one of the real benefits of doing that is to blow up silos, to make a team a cross-functional team. And those cross-functional teams include testers, they include BAs where necessary, those sorts of things. It became difficult. So given that we then start to scale and that there are other additional specialties to roll in there, it becomes important then to figure out how we take a step above and make sure that what we don't have is a team of one developer, one Scrum Master perhaps, and then somebody with individual specialties, and just replicate those silos across. So infrastructure, coordination are all part of what we're going to wrestle with. I'm not going to read the Agile Manifesto to you. I recommend that everyone in this industry that understand not only the principles, but the individual values, but also the principles. So the reality is that we value things more than the other. It doesn't mean that they go away. And still to this day, having been actively involved in Agile for roughly 10 years, I joined the Agile movement about a year and a half after it began. I mean, the reality is people still are going down the fact that we don't need documentation. We don't need well, the reality is we like all of those things. We just like certain things more. So Agile, adoption of Agile has to be effective to deliver within the context of your organization. And in reality, what we found over time is that data, real hard data, whether it's information from Dr. David Rico in Maryland, the data that my organization collects is that Agile does deliver value faster. Now I want to step back and think about that for a second. And in reality, if we're doing short iterations, and at the end of every iteration, it's possible to actually deliver that piece of software. If we're building software, if it's possible to deliver that so that it can run, well, we get to value faster. The one thing that over and over I will tell you is that while the data does look good overall, that we can get more done faster, in reality, the focus, especially at the team level, is to get it done sooner, so that we might be doing exactly the same amount of work and delivering the same amount of stuff over a given period of time, but we're doing it in small chunks, and we're doing it in such a way that some of it's there earlier so that we can get feedback. gentleman named Don Reinertson wrote a marvelous book, Second Generation Product Flow. I recommend that everyone read it. It goes through a wonderful proof of why Agile and Lean techniques work. Doing things earlier, getting to market, getting feedback is one of the reasons, both mathematically and from, if you just take a pure economist point of view, why that works. So in Agile, value is delivered incrementally and sooner, which in the long run maximizes value. Once upon a lifetime ago, one of the projects that I was involved with had run before it brought work to market for 5 years. It was a $168 million project, just grandiose, wonderful, beautiful beta of a wonderful data warehouse. However, the stuff that was built in year one most certainly didn't make any sense to the bank holding company that I was working for in year 5, even though we didn't cut over until that 5th year. Agile attempts to make all that stuff not happen. In the long run, our goal with any implementation of Lean and Agile is to really focus on speed, value, and quality. I mean, and we can look at the standard sort of house of Lean that whether it's SAFe uses or most Lean organizations use, and say to the reality is to make this stuff happen, we have to have a goal. We have to be moving towards something. We have to leverage people. We have to continuously improve that Kaizen. But all of that's built on a sort of a layer of leadership. The delivery practices, the Lean principles, all of that stuff sits inside of that house of Lean and provides sort of the horsepower to make that happen, to help people be better, so that we can continuously improve, so that we can affect those delivery practices. So Agile really, at team level, Agile is really focused on delivering that value of code quality. So we focus on quality because as data will tell us, the higher the quality, the more we get a quality piece of work, and that's what feedback helps get us to, the less rework we have, the faster we can move, the more value we can get out of that. So cross-functional teams in Agile, and this is where we start to get into why the things like the TMMi and making sure that that cross-functional team has testers and people that are quality oriented. Cross-functional teams help us to make sure that we have the highest value. Pairing is a mechanism for doing peer review. We can refactor code so that we break it down. We simplify it as we go along. I was reading an article last night about technical debt, and over it was stressing that you have to build in a mechanism so that as part of getting work done, and I think if we'll get to test-driven development, part of test-driven development is direct refactoring. So it helps us to simplify what we do. Simplicity is easier to maintain. Simplicity is generally easier to test. Things like continuous builds ensure integration. Automated testing builds knowledge across the team. But it only builds knowledge if we go back to that cross-functional team concept and that everybody is a participant in understanding what goes into that automated test. So, code quality, deliverable quality really is a focus at that team level. All of these scenarios really fundamentally increase the reality that V&V, verification, validation, I tend to use acronyms on occasion, I'll try to be better at that, are important. And there are all sorts of survey data that over and over that tell us that this isn't just a startup value. This isn't just a corporate value. That in reality, the industry research that's available demonstrates that we're not perfect. You know, some days I wake up and I think about projects that I'm working with or projects that I've seen and say, you know what, we haven't moved the ball farther down the road than we were 5 years ago. Well, I would suggest the reality is probably somewhat different than that. It is just probably an artifact of survey, but the reality is rework is still accounting for a large proportion, and this survey points out that it's 60 to 80%, that 71% of the organizations that, even though many of them are doing Agile, don't start really thinking about that until it's later in the process. Again, if we're truly doing Agile, and especially if we're doing Agile on large projects, we have to build the whole concept of testing across the life cycle, which means not only embedding it in the team, but embedding it in how we think. The concept that those that have scaled Agile well truly is that whole concept of thinking test first. And there are all sorts of different variants of it. The sort of the test first kind of concepts have been around for a while. The one that I think we'll talk most about is test-driven development. But in essence, why are we doing this? We want to increase communication. We want to increase communication within the team and across multiple teams. So by thinking test first and doing that at an organic level, not just it's that independent tester over there, we force better communication. Better requirements, better code, fostering that whole team concept. So, you know, and obviously this slide and this concept is compared against the whole concept of test last, right? Which is where perhaps a significant number of us grew up, right? That is, we get the material to test after the developers are done, and you can occasionally see that even in Agile, where the developers will work and then it'll go to the next step and it's Joe down at the end, and they then start to test it, and it's just a mini waterfall within an iteration. Or worse yet, it's I'll develop, we'll end that iteration, that sprint, and then we'll let the testers take over, and if they find stuff, we have to reopen it, and it gets messy. That's not a mechanism for scaling. It, in essence, is reinforcing the status quo of how we do work today. I call it testing apartheid, separate but equal, and it isn't. There is very little change. Now, obviously, if you're forced into that, that's the way your organization works, there are steps to take that I think will help make that better. You can leverage things like Kanban and not change your process, but at least start to show where you have those bottlenecks. Borrow that kind of concept from Lean. From a quality perspective, the impact of Agile at the team level has actually been looked at, and there's good data. And I leverage this from Dr. David Rico's presentation and some of the work that he's done in terms of actually looking at the cost of quality kinds of concepts and looking at Agile compared to other forms of quality, whether it's software inspections, traditional testing. And the data suggests that building into a cross-functional team has the lowest cost of quality, the highest productivity. So people get excited both positively and negatively when I use the word productivity. But in reality, if we're not delivering more stuff at a higher quality, at what point can we start to ask for a raise? Things like that. So it becomes very difficult. Productivity is that engine. So if you listen to Janet Yellen or some of the other central bankers, that's one of the reasons they talk about productivity. We're no different, right? So we have to not only lower our costs, but at the same time produce things of higher quality. And part of the Agile concept and why this gets us into the discussion of scaling is a discussion of product rather than project. And that's what takes us truly into more of a scaled approach. A project starts and ends. Most products, and that's really what we're interacting with on a daily basis, whether it's, I'm doing small enhancements to SAP, accounts payable isn't a project, I'm affecting a product. So Agile value principles, we can use that if we refocus our thought processes on product rather than project. It allows us then to leverage those Agile principles for guidance at the team level. We use things like Scrum, and again, there are others, but that's, it's fairly ubiquitous. People understand the construct of Scrum to describe team discipline, team roles, and the control structure around it. We use things like extreme programming for the technical structure. Test-first development is an artifact from extreme. Things like continuous builds, those sorts of things that allow us to get direct feedback in terms of what we've actually built. We might use portfolio Kanban to control the changes to a product, higher level piece, and then we use lean principles to identify bottlenecks and constraints. That comment earlier about if you can't truly do cross-functional teams, if you have to separate the two, why not leverage Kanban to see our bottlenecks and constraints, wasn't a throwaway comment. It was a suggestion that if we start to see where our bottlenecks are, we can then start to make fundamental changes to how we work based on data, which allows us to take a step and get closer to TMMi and scaled sorts of Agile. So before we throw these two things together for a second, what is the TMMi? TMMi is a standard reference model, standard framework for thinking about testing. For those of you who are conversant in the capability maturity model integration and have seen that model, structurally the model is, TMMi model is very similar. It has, in the maturity version of the CMMI, the TMMI has 5 steps in it, that 5 separate and distinct stages. It provides an assessment model. The big difference is that the TMMI is a set of best practices, omnibus macro set of best practices that are all about testing. Instead of like the CMMI having a verification process area and a validation process area, the TMMI is all about testing. Now, different than the CMMI, I see my Agile friends running for the hills when I say anything that ends with MMMI a lot of times. What the difference is this is eminently more scalable. You can take bits and pieces, and the model is built so that you can take those bits and pieces such that you can say, you know what, we have this problem, let's borrow this and use it from the TMMi kinds of scenario. So the formal goals of the TMMi really are, it provides a standard reference model. It's useful for identifying strengths, best practices, weaknesses. It allows a scenario where you can say, hey, here's where something hurts. Here's a potential solution for that, or at least here's a framework that suggests here's something that we can try. We'd have to go get a technique to fill that, but it's a mechanism that can be put with other facets. So interestingly enough, as a practitioner of both Agile and testing and the TMMi, the two are fundamentally, they're easy to leverage in terms of looking at test-driven development and saying, okay, I'm writing my tests up front, I'm executing to make sure they don't work, I then do the coding, I might pair with somebody to do that, and then finally I run the tests again and it works. That's a good framework for part of test-driven development, but that next step of refactoring, and what I do when I refactor to truly make it test-driven development is if you look at the TMMi, what you'll find is where the hooks and handles are and why that final step of refactoring, making things simpler, works so well not only for TDD, but test-driven development, but also from the point of view of why, from a control structure, that feedback mechanism it works within the testing model itself. So again, 5-stage model, pretty simple. We all recognize it's independent. Organization out of Ireland and the Netherlands oversee it. It's got a huge number of other test models that it is drawn upon over time. It's underpinned by risk management. All the basics that we would think of. Again, 5-stage model, initial, managed, defined, but focused on test only. We use this as a reference model to scale Agile testing because it, like most reference models, the TMMi is a great related list of what I would call whats. Here are the things that you ought to think about. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, it doesn't tell you how to do any of these. So we can begin the scaling process by looking at our Agile practices, how that verification and validation are tackled at the team level, and then the TMMi says, okay, if you're going to take it to a higher level, you're going to make it more robust, what are the steps? So if we know where we are to begin with, it helps us sort of, at least find gaps and overlaps, and then we can say, okay, if we have two teams that have to be related and have to coordinate, where are the holes that need to be dealt with? Now, again, two teams, that's a fairly easy process. Do you need a scaled Agile framework for two teams working together? Do we need the TMMi model for two teams? The answer is probably not. But if we're building something that's life critical, that if it breaks or if there's a snafu, then perhaps the answer is yes. If we have, and some of the teams that I work with have 30 or 40 Agile teams working together to deliver a single product. They might be doing multiple releases over a period of time, but they are affecting a single large product. There has to be different control structures to wrap around that. The TMMi provides some of the framework that we can say, okay, here are the steps that we need to do to coordinate quality and testing across this, this large number of interacting teams. Let's borrow from there, and then we can put in place agile and lean practices that actually address those, versus falling back on, I'm going to write a test plan, I'm going to get it signed off by all the teams, and oh, by the way, because they're refactoring, because they are perhaps changing their goals at the beginning of every sprint, maybe doing it on a larger basis later on, all of that sign-off stuff becomes relatively hard to enforce, but it also becomes a synchronization nightmare. So why is the TMMi useful to scale Agile? Well, again, the TMMi is not a rigid framework. It looks a lot like a rigid framework, but the way you apply it is fundamentally different. It's a list, it's a framework of best practices that say, these practices are related to each other, where's my gap? Here's the kind of thing that would fill this gap. We can use and then we can take a step back and say, okay, if that's the what, the how can be agile, the how can be lean. So it's tailorable to the business need. It's not a set of techniques or methods that are specific. And again, I would say that the tailorability is perhaps the most powerful portion of why the TMMi is a good mechanism to think through testing. It's at a level that almost everyone can be asked to understand. So if you have an organization that has gone down the path of saying, okay, we're going to have cross-functional teams. Now, some people might be better coders, some people might be better testers, but that cross-functional team is going to have to be a one-stop shopping for a function, let's say. Well, very frankly, everyone's going to have to know a little bit about testing. The testers can be consultants, they can lead everyone else forward, but the model helps everyone understand the steps that must be taken. So it provides us with a mechanism to identify opportunities, gaps, and it's tailorable. It's not rigid. It's a flexible mechanism to identify holes in the process, which again, I think make it fit much more nicely into an Agile framework. But okay, so enough theory. Let's actually think about how an organization actually dealt with this. So this is a case study that leveraged a large multinational organization. It had several large internal value streams. Think about those as separate and distinct products that they were moving forward in their IT. If I were thinking of that using different words, I might say they had several large internal programs. But I'd rather stay with more of an Agile word of product and value streams. Each application, and each one of those products had multiple applications, was pursuing its own development process. And there was all sorts of interesting sort of noise. We could use the term noise without offending anyone. And they would write all these wonderful documents, even though each thought they were, pursuing an Agile. But to communicate with each other, they would create large deliverable documents, ask people to sign them off. in reality, what was happening were they were making commitments to the business, they were making commitments to marketing and to internal customers, and dates were being missed. When they would get to a release, they would do that over a weekend. Says the group that I was working with and that we pulled this from couldn't go in during the week, so they because of the sensitivity, they would roll this in over a weekend, and everyone on the entire team across the 3 or 4 continents they were doing development would be on call or in the office working, and they were horror stories. I'm not convinced that many people on all of these teams actually were allowed to go to sleep during the weekend. So stuff didn't, when they put these things together, it didn't work well. And the quality, well, it was not good. We did a very light TMMi assessment and just had people self-qualify in this case. And what we saw was that a lot of things, the way they were approaching the work, and this is a macro version of that, test policies and strategies, there weren't many. They in some cases, they didn't really have any policies. So stuff was actually being implemented and not tested. There was light test planning. So there were all sorts of problems. They weren't doing any form of peer reviews. And peer reviews are one of my favorite items to talk about with Agile folks, because Agile tends to like peer reviews, whether it's pair programming, feedback, demonstrations, all of those are forms of peer reviews. So there's a lot of peer reviews that tend to happen if you've actually structured that and not decided that, well, to save some time, we won't demo, we won't do pair, we won't do test-driven development, we won't have the tester and the person's going to write the code sit side by side before they start and write the test cases. All of those, those kinds of things were missing. So just a quick view of the kinds of questions that we went through and asked across all of these teams, and obviously this is just a very subset. Do you perform product risk assessment that drives testing? So do you use risk? Do you have a test approach which is based on those identified risks? And in a lot of cases, the answer was no. So again, the goal in this case was to find out how the organization could improve quality and, in the end, make its process better, its agile processes better, so that A, not only were quality going to be better, but very frankly, people didn't start looking for new jobs every time a release was coming, so that they wouldn't have to be the ones that were on call that weekend. So obviously the prescription in this case was to retool, and instead of doing team level Agile, they stepped up and said, okay, I'm going to do Scrum and XP at the team level, but they were going to use SAFe. And again, Scaled Agile Framework, sort of a macro view, puts in control structures around that overarching Agile, so that you start to do things like Scrum of Scrums, so that there is a mechanism for coordination. You plan together. All sorts of good things. Disciplined Agile development has a number of the same kind of constructs. DSDM from Europe has a lot of the same constructs. They adopted test-driven development and the true test-driven development model, where test cases were written up front. They also, not here, well, it is in the next section, they did add Agile acceptance test-driven development to the test-driven development. Test-driven development tends to be more unit testing, and ATDD more of the acceptance. But they wrote those test cases. They came out of planning each team wrote them and created a consolidated view of how things would be tested over time, which was then used to build an overall test structure so that as individual pieces of code, regardless of team, were committed back into the applications and products, that those were all built on a daily basis, and then a test suite run against them based on the test-driven development test cases and the ATD test cases. They use the TMMi as a mechanism for generating a community of practice. So if you think of people on the teams as having a specialty, that if we think of them as T-shaped people, where the specialty of what they do is that long part of the capital T that goes up and down. They also had people that were, if I'm a tester, that's my specialty. I can do some coding, I can do some BA. I might also be working on the test automation and at the same time. But we use the TMMi community of practice as a mechanism to educate the teams and those with the specialty of testing so that they could then take that back into the individual teams. So they scaled to the program level using some of the basics, right? Self-organizing, self-managing agile teams, and they worked with system increments every 2 weeks. They aligned to a common mission by planning together, demonstrating together across all of those teams. Each one had a common sprint length. They all use the same estimation kind of collaboration. They go back over here for a second. They were leveraging things like test-driven development and the TMMi as a mechanism to do some of that synchronization. So they did face-to-face release planning, cadence for collaboration, alignment, synchronization, and assessment. But they really stepped back and said, the reality is we're going to focus on delivering features and benefits that have the highest value, and value and quality are highly interrelated. So I know that we've got roughly 20 minutes left, but just to give you a sense at the program layer, by taking things like the program definition, the architecture plan, release plan, and test architecture, so again, at that sort of overall program or product level, they not only described their test architecture that all the teams had to operate within, but they continued to keep that evergreen by taking information and the TDD output, the ATD, acceptance test driven output, back into that test architecture so they could build it forward. They were always slightly ahead of the organization. That provided sort of that overall overarching verification validation goal for the entirety of the program. Part of scaling is, when we talk about team level agile, is to deliver to the definition of done. And part of that definition of done was included all of the forms of testing that were required based on that overall test architecture. So again, leveraging things like the TMMi, the organization looked at what they were delivering and stepped back from that and said, okay, these are the forms of testing that are required. We need to, the product needs to be integrated at every commit. So every time code goes back into the staging, we have to run a number of integration tests against that so that by the time we're done, everything still fits together. And it does it seamlessly. So it does it so that we're not embarrassed. That allows the teams at the individual teams, having that structure from above, to make daily decisions and get immediate feedback on those decisions so that they, well, immediate decisions, they don't have to wait for somebody else to make the decision for them. The feedback allows them to know whether or not it was right. So all of this high-level guidance, again, based on things like the test architecture, which they use the TMMi to form, allowed the teams to focus on delivering value and knowing that they couldn't get too far off track. The whole concept of a capability team, and that's probably less controversial than it was a few years ago when it was dropped in, is really this whole idea of the team, the individual team doing the work, really has to have most, if not all, of the capabilities needed to do the piece of work that they're going to accept into it. So as you're doing that macro planning and then the micro team level planning, the capability team is going to include things like developers, testers, business analysts, those things that are required to get the work done. They will know each other. And I can spend many hours going through the psychology of why that works and why that works well, and then the numbers in terms of looking at higher quality, higher productivity. But even though I would say this is not a controversial topic, I think all of us would look back and go, you know what, we changed teams more than some people change their socks. We change the people on it. We form teams rather than to reform the work to the teams. The workflow iteration, as we break this down, each layer steps back, and each layer then was allowed us to reintegrate back into using the TMMi model as a framework. If we just look at the test pieces here, we wanted to accumulate, have a team charter at the team level. It was actually 3 flip chart pages. For those of you who say charter, that sounds crazy. That in essence made everyone understand what their role was and what their obligation was to support their fellow team members. Relatively easy thing to do. But as part of that, we also then allowed us to say, you know what, in this case, for the set of groups, we need to document the performance tests. We need to understand and keep all of the functional test results as they occur to build an overall test data architecture going back to that top level so that over time we can get something closer to fully automated. More automated the better. Obviously nothing ever makes sense as 100% automated, but if we can gather that data as we go along, it makes the job of doing that, getting it as close as it needs to be, simpler. So they implemented TDD within the overall TMMi structure. But again, right, so the goal here was to not only implement TDD and ATDD, but to ensure that there was a rationale, there was a strategy and policy, that the planning component actually happened. And again, if we think about planning, what is writing down my tests before I write a line of code, but planning how I'm going to approach this. So it gave them a model to check back with, to say, you know what, these do make sense, these are the right steps, we're not going to take apart test-driven development. We're not going to take apart acceptance test-driven development and only cherry pick out the individual items. So if you're going to go down that path, by the way, TDD, test-driven development, ATDD, all really good processes, really great practices. You need to weigh those costs and benefits carefully. Test first. The whole framework, I think, can be easily quantified. If you don't know how to do that, I can certainly help you think about that. Read Douglas Hubbard's book on how to measure anything. It'll give you a number of mechanisms to actually address that. But there has to be, you have to understand what the costs and what the benefits are. And there are. You're going to have to train everyone on the team to be able to do that. And that, again, if we go back to the TMMi really, says, we're going to look at the processes and the practices, but at the same time, we have to know to be able to implement that, we're going to have to train people. There has to be a support structure so that they understand why and how, and do it and get feedback from it. So overall, after that's all said and done, the organization, they were able to get to a point where they were able to drop in their releases, they were able to coordinate and predict when they were going to deliver critical functionality. Things that were on the, hey, it's a nice to have, obviously those flowed in and flowed out. But those things that were critical to the business, critical to the internal portion of the business, they were able to predict when those were happening. They had release plans and overarching sort of release structures that allowed them to talk about that. Their releases were fully tested. And we can debate what that word fully meant, but the bottom line was they ended up with far fewer delivered defects. People didn't have to spend the entirety of the weekend just to get it in, to fight through it, to get it to a point where when business started, when the teller showed up, that it actually worked. And that in the end, not only were the internal customers happier, but the external customers were happier. And again, they measured that as a tool to give feedback not only to the internal IT organization, but at the same time, the folks that actually were delivering. So if you're thinking about continuing that evolution, a friend of mine, Raj Pavani, who's now at Cognizant, back in 2012, put together a great Agile maturity model. And it's a combination of delivery concepts and testing concepts. All of these make sense in terms of thinking about how one integrates and then scales up Agile from a team practice using things like the TMMi as a mechanism to spin those up to a level that they actually can handle large-scale work. As we sort of finish this, know your testing performance goals. That has to be built into, and that's part of that overall testing architecture, test planning as an organization. Assess where you are. Plan to close those gaps, both from a process at a team level, but also at the program level. And don't expect that you'll use the same processes and practices that you've done to run standard plan-based. The need is the same. The how is fundamentally different. Measure. Agile and measurement are not antithesis either. So make sure that you understand the information that you're getting. Stop doing things that don't work. Continuously improve as you go along. Use frameworks like the TMMi to have that conversation. So why don't we break for questions, Eric, and push this forward?
Great. That sounds great. You do have a couple questions. If you want to go ahead and that.
I have to get that to open up. Now, it's not showing up again, so why don't you read them to me? I'm going to apologize.
No problem, no problem. One of the questions is the trade-off of product owners wanting Agile and not getting along with the needed tools for Agile is worrisome. The reason being the cost and security consideration depending on open source materials. Is Agile a complete effort without test automation?
No. No. I really don't think that Agile is complete without some form of test automation. It's not impossible, and I would suggest that you do Agile even if you can't do test automation, but test automation really is where you're going to find the substantial benefit of productivity and speed. Agile, as a rule, things like Scrum, the whole manifesto really were pointed toward let's get the customer satisfaction up. Let's make sure that we're delivering what people actually wanted. Not necessarily let's do that in the most effective and efficient manner. That's where automation and the technical side of Agile comes from. So you need to work on grappling with that. If you can't do open source, and there are all sorts of non-open source tools. I know organizations where part of each iteration, they have some extra time carved out to start writing their own frameworks, harnesses, and test tools themselves as a means of getting around and getting toward some degree of automation.
Okay, great. Next question is when does user story additions from the backlog to the current sprint become a no-no for development? Does this undermine the product owner stakeholders' happiness? What can we do?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but I'm going to paraphrase it and answer that question. Hopefully, if that's not right, please either re-ask the question or send that to Eric, and we'll get that answered externally. When do you not change, add things to the backlog? Well, the answer is right after the program, product, or project ends. After it's over, then I wouldn't add anything. Once something is taken into a team, right? A piece of work is taken into an individual sprint team, you're not going to mess with it until it's done with that individual iteration. That's why you do short iterations. So I'm not going to mess with it in the team. I'm not, but that overall backlog should be viable, pliable across the entirety of the life of the project. Recognize, though, and this is the hard part to recognize, and it's probably not the problem that these people were having, but if you add something to that backlog, if the product owner, if the developers, if someone from the technical side of the house adds something to the backlog, and you're working to a fixed date or a fixed amount of money, something else has to come off. Unless you fundamentally change the law of physics or found another great way to increase your productivity, something has to come off. So it is always a trade-off. The product owner role is one of the hardest roles, but part of what makes that work is that you have to have that conversation continuously as any piece of work moves forward, that they own that backlog, they can change it, but every time that gets changed, there are implications, there are consequences to actions. So if that didn't work for you in terms, if I misunderstood the question, please either re-ask or send that another to Eric, and we'll answer it. Oh.
Sorry about that, Tom. Next, we have time for one more question here. Can you speak a bit about the importance of regression testing while working in Agile? Is automated testing most important here?
Obviously, regression testing, automating your regression testing so that every time you commit a piece of code to the staging library, to the QA library, every time that commit happens, you should run, in a perfect world, you should be able to run that set of regression tests. Automation makes that possible, makes that fast enough that it isn't. If I go back in time when I ran regression tests manually, the answer was that wouldn't be possible. So automation makes that possible. So automating that is a really great idea. You're going to have to hybridize things if you're not automating. It is critically important that you test every time that you commit. So absolutely, regression testing is a huge deal.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Tom, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can also follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about IIST news, events, and promotion. Be sure to join IIST for the next webinar, What Product Teams Need to Know About Test Automation by Jim Trentadue on March 11th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. You can register for this and other webinars at psqtconference.com. Thank you all again for joining us today, and hope you have a great day. Thanks again, Tom.
My pleasure. Thanks, Eric.